Hey everyone, I'm Ted. Welcome to Discount Ted, where I'm going to show how to maintain my champagne taste on a beer budget. So today we're going to work on my 1994 Nissan Patrol, or Nissan Safari in this case, a Y60 Safari. And I'm going to show you how to replace the thermostat on it. I got it just a few months ago in the spring, and it would just never build engine temperature, and I knew I had to get this taken care of before the winter because I wanted to have heat. I couldn't find any videos on how to replace a thermostat in a Y60 Patrol. In this case, it's a TB42E. It's a 4.2 liter gas engine. And hopefully this is helpful to you guys. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right in.
Alright, so starting with my parts list. The first thing you'll need is a new thermostat. You also need a new thermostat housing gasket, liquid gasket, coolant to replace the coolant that we're removing. I also got a thermostat housing, and I also got an upper radiator hose. The thermostat housing was pretty inexpensive and hard to get, particularly considering this is a JDM vehicle and I'm trying to work on it here in the US. Same with the upper radiator hose. So as long as I was placing an order for any of the parts that needed to come overseas, I just went ahead and got several that were all in the area I was going to be working. Now going over my tool list, you can see I need a Phillips screwdriver, flathead screwdrivers, a ratchet with a 6-inch extension, 10 and 12 millimeter sockets for the ratchet, something to catch my coolant in my case, a empty protein container. You also need a funnel, rags, gloves. I'm using a baster in a relatively unique way. You'll see as we get through there. Also good to have some zip ties, side cutters, a razor blade, brake cleaner, and then in my case I've got a big old crowbar there as this persuasion tool. It's probably a bit of overkill, and you'll see when I get in there and use it why I needed something that was pretty rough. Here we're taking a look at the engine bay of my Nissan Patrol. It's, as you can see, an inline 6 TB42. It's a pretty straightforward engine, and we've got the thermostat right up front showing right here at the top. This is a pretty standard design for thermostats and thermostat housings, and hopefully it's something that is also helpful in other vehicles. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I going to do just my thermostat and not bother doing my whole cooling system? Because often, if you're doing a thermostat, you probably have an aged water pump, you probably have an aged radiator, and it's a good idea to do more work than just the thermostat itself. But in my case, looking at my water pump, here you can see it's really, really new with new sealant all the way around it. My guess is that they did a new thermostat before the car came overseas, or they did a new water pump before the car came overseas, but they didn't do a new thermostat. It's a good idea to go ahead and put something down to help clean up your mess. I'm hoping that I don't drip very much, and we'll see how I do. But in my case, I just put down an old cardboard box, some kitty litter, and that'll catch everything that I drop, or at least hopefully will catch everything that I drop. Before I remove parts, I like to double check, hey, does the new part I have look like it's going to replace the old part? And fortunately, we're in luck here. This looks exactly right. I can see the 3 bolts that hold the thermostat housing in. I can see my top sort of vent hose, and generally speaking, everything looks to be pointing the right direction. So good news is I did order appropriately. So I'm going to start by removing as much coolant as I possibly can, just using my baster to suck up coolant and drain it off into my coolant container or my coolant housing, whatever you want to call it. Again, because I'm not draining the whole thing, I just want to get as much out as I possibly can so I spill as little on the ground as possible. Now finally we're into working. So I've drained out some coolant, and I'm going to start by removing the upper radiator hose. So I'm using my Phillips screwdriver to just loosen up these clamps. I'm going to get the clamp loose as much as I possibly can. This hose is pretty old, and so you can see these ring clamps sort of adhered themselves into the hose itself. So I got to get it as loose as possible, and then I'll give it a little bit of a rattle kind of side to side just to make sure that it's loose. And then I'll go ahead and start peeling this guy back and peel it up and over the hose just to get it away from the hose itself. You can see I kind of have to fiddle with it. I sped this portion up just a little bit so that you could see how that works. And once I get it away from the thermostat housing, then it'll be ready to go. And now that I've got that clamp pulled as far down as I can, now I'm going to go ahead and use a flathead screwdriver just to slightly pry it away. These hoses tend to get pretty hot and cold, and all those heat cycles sometimes sort of glue that hose onto the metal thermostat housing. So that little bit of persuasion just helps to break it loose when it comes time. And I didn't drain all my coolant out, so I'm going to put my Coolant Catch Can in. It's going to block your view on the video. I apologize for that. But I just wanted somewhere to put the coolant if there was anything left in there. And at this point, I realized that I also need to clear off this one extra bolt that's just this center holder. So I start with my screwdriver because it's a Phillips head screw head, but unfortunately, it's pretty snug. So now I'm going to go down and get a socket, and I'm going to go ahead and put a 10mm socket on it and break this guy loose. So break that bolt loose, I'll get it all the way out, and then just get that hose clamp, that center holder, off of the holder itself. One thing you won't see in the video, but that I like to do, is I do like to just put that bolt back in its receptacle afterward. So I'll get it all the way out, get the clamp out of the way, and then just put that bolt right back in the hole where it was. That way I don't have to go looking for it later, it's just right where I left it. Now that I've fiddled it out of the way, I'm just wiggling it around, and again, I apologize for the terrible video angle, but I'll get better in the future. I'll probably get better clamps and hardware and everything, but it's now out of the way, and I'm ready to pull the hose off. So I'll pull that hose off, just give it some wiggles kind of thing, and when it comes off, much to my surprise, no coolant came out at all. So I did a good job draining from the top, and hopefully the bottom connection point will do the same thing. So again, the video is not a great angle, but we've got the same sort of control here down at the upper radiator connection. So we've taken off the thermostat, the other spot that this is at the top of the radiator. So it's the exact same sort of clamp. You can also see that I removed a few zip ties here. So those zip ties were holding a wire loom on the edge of the radiator hose. It's probably not how they intended for it to be held from the factory, but it works, and I just needed to remove them since I'm replacing the hose, and that's why you need zip ties. So I need those to replace those zip ties that I cut off. So this overflow hose just ends up being in my way a little bit, so I just push that out of the way. And then just below that field of view, you can't see, I'm doing the same thing with the clamper. I'm just pushing it off away from the radiator. And then once I get it away, I'll use the Phillips head or flathead screwdriver. Do it a little pry away from the radiator just to make sure that they're separated. And then here you'll be able to see a little bit better on how I wiggle this out. Clamps out of the way, flathead screwdriver. And now I'll just put one solid hand on it, just wiggle it a bit. And I'm hopeful that there's no coolant come out, but yeah, as you probably hear in the dripping, sure enough, coolant did fall there. So that's why we have our drip tray. It's not a big deal. Now that I've got the upper radiator hose off, the next thing I can do is take this overflow hose off. So it's a very similar clamp to the large clamps, it's just smaller. So I'm going to again use my Phillips head screwdriver, get this guy loosened up, and as soon as it's loose, sort of pull it away. There's a bit less of a barb on this, or less of a ledge that you have to go over, so it's the same idea as the thermostat housing, just everything's smaller and a little bit easier to do. And you could do this first. I'm just doing it now because I was so excited about getting the radiator hose off first. Unfortunately, my clamp came apart as I pulled it. You see that, and now I'll go ahead and just pull this out of the way, take a look at it, and get down below and I'll find that bolt. And there's the bolt. I found it. It has a little washer component to it, and I'll get it all put back together just so that it's ready to go when I'm ready to put everything back tidied up. Perfect. We're finally ready to start taking off the thermostat housing, and I'm a big fan of eating the frog, so to speak. So I'll put my 12mm bolt on the back one, and as you can see, they're really snug. So got the hardest to do one first, and then now I'm going to go to the second hardest, and finally I'll do the easiest one after that. So get them broken loose, just get them a few threads loose. I don't want to take it all the way out, and that way I get all of them loose and broken free, and it's easier to remove all of them after the fact. Sometimes if you take one all the way out, you can end up with one left that's just really, really stuck in there. I don't have to get other breaker bars out and what have you, so just get them all broken loose before you start taking any of them out. I've got the first one out. Use my ratchet again, just kind of twist on the ratchet. It's a nice easy way to continue getting those bolts out. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and get the last one out after I get this second one all the way out. So while you're watching this, I'll talk about why you need that persuasion tool. So I already talked about the baster and how that's sort of unique. And please, please don't use a baster that you intend on using food again. It will never get clean. Just get a cheap baster at the dollar store or Walmart or whatever, and let it be your automotive baster. You can use it for coolant, brake fluid, and all those things, but never use it for food. So then I've got all the bolts out. I need some sort of tool of persuasion because there's a sealant on here that's going to make it really, really tight to get off. I tried using a hammer. I tried using a few things, your flathead screwdriver, but I ultimately ended up using my pry bar here and just popped it in there, pulled it up, and big tools make for easy work. So finally, I'm going to pull this out, and my thermostat is exposed. I was sort of surprised. I thought there wasn't going to be a thermostat in there since it held no temperature whatsoever. But as you can see, it's broken, wide open, and the coolant was always flowing, which explains why I was never getting any temperature in the engine. So now we're going to clean off all of the old gasket material. This is pretty sped up because, quite frankly, it's an arduous process. It's not a fun process, but it does need to get done. So I started by draining more coolant out of the thermostat housing, or the hole that the thermostat was sitting in, and I put a rag in there just to make sure that none of this stuff gets into my cooling system. My cooling system is really good at running water through it. It's not good at running plastic and paper gasket material and all those other things that I'm going to be scraping off. So just toss a few rags down in there, drain out as much as you possibly can, and then go to town with your razor. So I'm using my razor blade to just peel off all the big components that I can. Then I'll use my fingers to sort of peel away beyond that. And then eventually this will speed up quite a bit more, and you'll see that I'm using a chemical called brake cleaner to clean this off. It's a really heavy-duty solvent. You can get it anywhere. Just make sure you wear gloves. I mean, it's a great job at cleaning things and getting adhesives off of stuff, but it also does a great job at drying out your skin and doing terrible things to your body. So wear some gloves, use it carefully to start, and then as you see, I get pretty liberal with my spraying of it as I move forward. So I'm just cleaning off all this gasket material using the tools available to me. Make sure that you are cautious when you're using a razor blade, your screwdriver, whatever it is to get this stuff off. You do want to get all the gasket material off, but you also don't want to gouge any of the metal. You can really, really easily end up putting scrapes in the metal, and then you end up with more stuff that you have to seal up. You have to use more sealant in the future to keep it from leaking, if you can even do that. Sometimes you put a big enough gouge in it that it just always leaks, and that's certainly not ideal. So use those tools, but use them gently. When in doubt, work softer than harder, and you'll be okay. It's a good idea after you feel like you've got all the gasket material out, pull your rags out and just give it a third, fourth, fifth wipe through. Just make sure that you don't have anything in there other than, in this case, nothing or coolant. You just want to make sure that you don't start pumping pieces of plastic or gasket through your cooling system. So I'll place my new thermostat in, and fortunately give it a little wiggle. It fits just like it should, so I'm not having to order more parts from overseas. And now I'm going to go ahead and open up my thermostat gasket. So I've got a gasket that matches this, ordered it with it, and first thing I like to do is place it down, make sure that it fits the way that I think it's going to, make sure I don't have to index it a certain way or that I've got the wrong part. Again, just easier to figure that out before you start putting bolts to stuff. And here I'm going to make a bit of a mistake. So up to this point, I've been a pretty flawless mechanic, but unfortunately, I didn't read all the directions on my liquid gasket. It tells you that you need to put a pretty heavy bead of this all the way around both sides of the gasket material. And instead, I assumed that I just put a few dabs, just enough to stick it together here. So I'll get it opened up with my side cutters, and I put a few dabs on there. You'll see soon, or later in this video, it ends up leaking on me, and I end up having to take this all apart. And fortunately, I can't tell you why I had the foresight to do this, but I bought 2 of these thermostat gaskets. I suppose they were only a couple of dollars each, and I was making a $80 or so parts order from overseas, from Japan, and just getting an extra one seemed like a good idea for a low cost. And I'm very, very glad that I did it. So I was able to take this all off and put another new one in its place. So here I'm doing a few dabs. Ignore that, fast forward through this, do whatever you want to do, but in reality this should be a heavy bead all the way around on both sides. I'll show a picture of what it looks like from the top before I put everything back together, so you'll see what I mean by a heavy bead. But in any case, here you get to watch a shade tree mechanic make shade tree mistakes, and why you get to do things twice. I'm putting dabs here on the top again. Again, ignore this. That's not how you do it. It should be a good thick bead. So now that I think I've got this all set, it's time to start putting on my thermostat housing. So we've got the housing, we already checked, looks right, and I'm just gonna lightly place it down on top of the thermostat and gasket. So you don't wanna wiggle it around, you've got a gasket there that's sitting in one particular spot. So just try and set it down as straight as you possibly can, and then get one bolt in, just get it finger tight, and then get the second bolt in, and then you can start really tightening it down. So as I'm getting these tightened up, you're probably asking yourself, hey, is there a torque spec, or how tight should I be putting these? The answer is yes, I'm sure there's a torque spec, and I did not look it up. So instead, I paid quite a bit of attention to how tight these were when I took them off, and I'm sort of just giving it a muscle feel of about the same level of tightness going back. It's not ideal, that's not what most people would tell you to do, and work with the tools that you have. I happen to have a torque wrench, and I was literally just that lazy to not put it in. Obviously, we're going to get to do this again, since I've told you I made a mistake, but all you do here is get them finger tight, get everything lined up, and then use the same 12mm socket that you used to take it apart, and tighten it back up. So now that we've got our new thermostat housing in, I'm going to go ahead and put on the overflow hose, and then I'm going to move on to putting on my new radiator hose. So just like all the other parts that I've used so far, it's always a good idea to just place it next to or place it in place of where you're going to put it, just to make sure that it's the right part before you get too far ahead of yourself. First, I take off that other clamp. That seems like the easier thing. It's smart. And then we'll take off the lower clamp. And then now I've got to take the center holder off. So the center holder, I sort of had to bend to get clear of the hose. I wanted to do everything on camera, but I just needed a little more leverage. So I just used my hands to bend it. It's pretty thin metal, but once I got a little bit of a bend in it, I was able to get it out and around the hose. There might be a better way of doing that. Maybe you can feed the hose without bending it, but I'm just not that patient, and realistically, it's just there to hold that coolant hose in place. It doesn't need to be perfect. So after getting it off the old hose, just feed it onto the new hose, kind of set it in place, make sure things look right, and I'll clamp that up and get it tightened and rebent back at the very last end of the whole process. So now that I've got it there, I'm going to start putting on my hose clamps, and here I make another pretty critical mistake. So this is the hose clamp from the radiator side of the hose. Instead, I'm trying to put it on the thermostat side, and I didn't realize until quite an embarrassingly long amount of time later that that's not where it goes. They're different sizes. The radiator side is noticeably smaller, and really the learning part here, the teachable part here, is if something doesn't fit at first and you spend 2 or 3 minutes trying to make it work, trying to fit it on there, just double check that you've got the right part. You just took it off, you know that it's not a part for a different vehicle or ordered the wrong thing, but sometimes you're putting things in the wrong place, and rather than spend, in my case, say 20 minutes or so trying to take it apart, push it, force it, figuring that maybe the hose just really needs to condense down, just do yourself a favor and do a second look at the parts available to you, and you'll realize much faster than I did that this is not the appropriate clamp for the job. So after taking it apart, fiddling with it, fighting it, I eventually figure out here that, yep, I do need to use a different clamp and switch it out. Alright, so when I finally figure out that I've got the wrong one, now I've got to take this whole thing apart. And of course, I've put this radiator hose onto the thermostat housing, and the thermostat housing is pretty snug. So that's good. It means it won't leak there. but it means I can't just take it apart and take the whole clamp off that way. So instead, I need to take my holder off, take my clamp off the other direction, and then feed my bigger clamp, the one that I should have been working with this whole time, all the way up to the front. So I feed my large clamp all the way over the hose, get it placed where it needs to be, and it fits nice and easily. And so now I'll put the clamp component of it over the hose. You didn't need to take it apart to put it there. I just had after I've already been messing with the other one so many times, but yeah, you certainly don't need to. You could just leave it all together, and quite frankly, that would be easier for you. So after I get that clamp back together, I go ahead and tighten it down with the Phillips head screwdriver. Honestly, a better idea would be to hook up all the rest of the hose components, get the clamps in place. But suffice it to say, you saw how long that video was probably before it was sped up, and I was pretty dang frustrated. So at this point, I decided, yep, just go ahead and get this thing good and tight. So one trick to this when you're putting on loose hose clamps is you can see I've kind of got my hand around the clamp. I'm just holding it lightly in place because you have to put a little bit of pressure on the Phillips head screwdriver in order to, get everything to grip and not just slip on you. So I'm just putting my hand in place there, holding it so that it doesn't push away from me down below, away from where the Phillips head screwdriver is. So I'm going to get it good and tight. In fact, I end up using my 10mm socket to get these really good and tight. You can get hose clamps too tight. I should tell you that first and foremost. In my case, I'm using them pretty dang tightly because I'm putting it all on metal components and I'm using these original clamps. The aftermarket clamps you can get at your local hardware store or your local auto parts store, and there's nothing wrong with them, but they do tend to put pinch points on the hose itself. These ones distribute that tightness, that force a bit more effectively, and I'm not as concerned with getting them super, super tight. And a little bit tighter will help keep it from leaking on me. So I got the upper radiator hose on. I'm going to do the same thing to the lower radiator hose here. And then we're going to get that clamp in the center all set up. Finally, after I get the center clamp in place, I'll also use my zip ties to go ahead and zip tie in that small wire loom that honestly I didn't trace back to see what it is, nor do I know where it was probably supposed to go. But it wasn't hurting anything on the radiator. The radiator hose didn't get that hot to where it would harm any of those wires, and it seemed like a safe enough place to just let it go ahead and hang out and not flail around in the engine bay. Alright, so everything's in place. Now it's just time to start adding some coolant back into my radiator. So I've got my funnel in place, just double check that everything looks good, and I'm going to start pouring my coolant in. Behind there you can see some of my other project cars. We've got my 996, my wife's BMW X3. I do a few little projects here and there on those, and I'll add some videos as those come up. And unfortunately, you can hear as I'm pouring pretty quickly here, we're going to hear a bit of a drip. And as I mentioned, not reading the directions on my liquid gasket came to bite me. Some expletives were said shortly after I cut this clip, and I'm sure you can understand why. Alright, so since I'm doing this again, I just went ahead and unbolted the thermostat housing, pulled it back off. I didn't bother removing all the hoses. I just pulled everything out of the way. And here you can see what that thermostat gasket should look like with a nice thick bead of the liquid sealant on it, or the liquid gasket. Again, read directions on stuff before you do things. Don't be as dumb as I am. And just put a nice thick heavy coat on. I put the same level of coat on the bottom, and here you can see what I put on top. And now I'm just going to go ahead and bolt everything up. So I'm just going to place the thermostat housing over the thermostat and gasket, get it right where it should be, and then go ahead and hand tighten the bolts and do this whole process that you've already seen once before. So just get them hand tight, then go ahead and put my ratchet on and get them good and snugged up. Try and snug them around in a circle, not just snug one down and then snug the rest of them. I also let this cure for a bit after. So After I got everything sealed up, I went ahead and let it cure for a full 24 hours before I put any coolant in it. That was probably overdoing it on time. You could probably cure it for just a couple of hours. The instructions on the liquid gasket material said at least 2 hours, up to 24 is when it's totally sealed. So I went ahead and gave it a full 24 because I really didn't want to do it a third time. I'm happy to say, after letting it cure, filling it up with coolant, I was able to drive the car, drive the Patrol for quite a distance in hot weather, and the thermostat worked flawlessly. It got right up to temp where it should be, didn't overheat, and it got up to temp quickly, so I know that my thermostat is accurately closing when the water is cold. So I'm excited to have heat, and I hope that this is really helpful to someone else out there with a TB42 powered Nissan Patrol or Nissan Safari. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments or otherwise. I'm looking to make these videos helpful to others out there, and I'll try to improve in the future. Thanks again.